Her name was Jessica, and I had invented her 3 weeks before my parents arrived. Not her entirely. Jessica was a real person, a colleague who sat 2 desks away from me at work and who had agreed, with the particular good nature of someone who finds the situation amusing rather than inconvenient, to be my girlfriend for a weekend. We had rehearsed the details on a Thursday evening over bad coffee in the break room, how we met, how long we had been together, what she studied in college, what her parents did. I had written some of it down in a notebook like a man preparing for a performance, which is exactly what I was. My parents flew in from Houston on a Friday afternoon, and Jessica came to dinner on Saturday, and she was charming and warm, and my mother liked her immediately. And my father asked her questions about her career with the attentiveness he reserved for people he was genuinely impressed by, and I sat at the table I had set in my apartment, and I watched all of it happening, and I felt the specific combination of relief and nausea that comes from successfully deceiving the people you love most in the world. Jessica left at 10, my parents went to bed at 11. I sat alone at the kitchen table in the dark for a long time, not because the evening had gone badly, because it had gone perfectly. And because the perfection of it had made something that I had been managing for years suddenly and completely unmanageable. I was 34 years old, and I was sitting alone in my kitchen at midnight after successfully pretending to be someone I was not for the people who had raised me, and the question that arrived in the dark was not how do I keep doing this. It was who am I when I stop. My name is Marcus Webb. I am 41 years old now. I was 34 on the night of the dinner, and I had been, for the preceding 10 years, a person living in the specific exhaustion of someone who presents one version of himself to the world and carries a different one in private, and who has become so practiced at the management of the gap between those 2 versions that the management has started to feel like the primary activity of his life. I grew up in Houston in a Nigerian-American household where my father was a civil engineer and my mother was a pediatrician, and where the expectations for their only son were not stated as pressure because they did not need to be stated. They were simply present the way gravity is present, not as something you are asked to acknowledge, but as something you navigate every moment without thinking about it. I was the son who was going to continue something, who was going to build on what had been built, who was going to marry and have children and extend the line of a family that had come from Lagos to Houston with discipline and faith and the specific investment of parents who had given everything to make a particular future possible. I loved my parents. I love them still with a completeness that has not been diminished by any of what I am about to tell you. I had simply become, by the age of 34, a man who understood that the future they had made possible and the person I actually was were not the same shape, and that the gap between those shapes had been the central unaddressed fact of my adult life. The 10 years between 24 and 34 had been the years of management. Management of what I said and what I did not say. Management of who I brought home and who I did not bring home. Management of the questions my mother asked at Thanksgiving about whether I had met anyone and the answers I gave that were technically honest and practically misleading. Management of my father's occasional comments about legacy and continuity and what he hoped for his son's future that I received with the nod of a man who shares the hope, and that I filed in the specific internal location where I kept the things I was not ready to address. I had relationships in those 10 years. Real ones with real people that had real feeling in them, and that I ended when they reached the point where continuing would have required bringing them into the part of my life that I was managing rather than living. I told myself the timing was wrong. I told myself I was focused on my career. I told myself that I would address the central fact when I was more established, more secure, more ready, more something. I was always almost ready. I was never actually ready. The dinner with Jessica was the thing that broke the almost. Jessica called me on Monday morning after the dinner. She asked how I was. I told her I was fine. She said, "Marcus, can I say something honest?" I said yes. She said, "Your parents are wonderful people. Your mother talked about you for 20 minutes while you were in the kitchen, and the way she talked about you was the way people talk about someone they love completely and without condition. I think you might be underestimating them." I said, "It is more complicated than that." She said, "It always is. Until it isn't." We talked for 40 minutes that Monday morning, and it was the most honest conversation I had had with anyone in years about the specific situation, because Jessica was the first person I had told the full story to, and because telling the full story to someone who responded with clarity rather than judgment had the effect of making the story audible to me in a way it had not been when I was carrying it alone. Jessica was not a therapist. She was a colleague with good judgment and the specific gift of saying the true thing without performing the saying of it. She said, "You have been protecting them from something they might actually be able to handle. And you have been protecting yourself from finding out." I wrote that down. I looked at it for 3 weeks. Then I called my parents. The 3 weeks between Jessica's Monday morning observation and the call to my parents were the 3 weeks in which I did the work that the preceding 10 years had been deferring. I talked to a therapist I had seen twice before and had stopped seeing because the sessions had been moving toward the territory I was not ready to enter. I was ready now. I talked to 2 friends who knew the full picture and who had been waiting with the patience of people who love you and know better than to push for me to arrive at this moment. I read things I had been meaning to read for years and had been avoiding for years. I sat with the specific fear that had been the engine of the management, the fear that the love I had always experienced from my parents was conditional on a version of me that I had been performing, and that the real version would not receive the same love. I sat with that fear long enough to examine it honestly, and what I found when I examined it honestly was that the fear was built on an assumption I had never actually tested. I had assumed the conditional nature of the love. I had never given my parents the opportunity to show me whether the assumption was accurate. The dinner with Jessica had been the product of the assumption. The assumption had been the product of 10 years of not testing it. It was time to test it. I called them on a Sunday evening. Both of them on the family video call we had every few weeks, the one where my mother showed me what she was cooking and my father told me about the engineering project he was consulting on in retirement. I let the ordinary part of the call happen first because the ordinary part was real, and I wanted them to know that what I was about to say was happening inside the ordinary relationship we had, and not as a rupture of it. Then I told them clearly and specifically and without the management that had governed every conversation on this subject for 10 years. I told them about Jessica and what the dinner had actually been and why I had arranged it. I told them about the 10 years. I told them about the fear and what it had been built on and what I had come to understand about whether the foundation of the fear was accurate. I told them who I was in the full and unmanaged sense of that phrase. My mother was quiet for a long time after I finished. My father did not speak at all for several minutes. I sat with the silence and I did not try to fill it because the silence was theirs and they had earned the right to take whatever time they needed with what I had just given them. Then my mother said something that I will carry for the rest of my life. She said, "Marcus, I have been your mother for 34 years. Did you think I did not know my own son?" And my father said, "We have been waiting for you to be ready. We are glad you are ready." That was not what I had spent 10 years expecting. It was better than anything I had been willing to hope for. The year after the call was not a resolved year in the way that stories about identity and family sometimes present the year after the central disclosure as resolved. It was a complicated year in which the relief of the disclosure coexisted with the grief of the 10 years that had preceded it. The 10 years of management and the relationships ended before they could grow, and the Thanksgivings navigated, and the questions answered misleadingly, and all the energy that had gone into maintaining the gap between the version and the person. My parents and I had conversations in that year that we had not had before, and some of them were difficult, and some of them were the best conversations of my adult life. My father asked me questions I had not expected him to ask, and they were good questions. The questions of a man who was genuinely trying to understand something he had not fully understood before, and who had the humility to ask rather than assume. My mother introduced me at a family gathering in Houston the following Christmas, not with management language, but with the language of a woman presenting the son she actually had. I stood in my aunt's living room and I was the person I was and my family was around me, and the specific quality of the room was different from every previous family gathering I could remember. It was lighter, not because the room had changed. Because I was not managing anything in it. I am 41 years old and I am the person I have been for 41 years who spent 10 of them managing the presentation of that person, and who spent the year after a dinner with a fake girlfriend finally becoming someone who did not need the management. I have a partner now. His name is David, and he has met my parents, and my mother cooks for him when we visit Houston, and my father talks to him about engineering with the attentiveness he reserves for people he is genuinely impressed by, which is the same attentiveness he turned on Jessica at a dinner table 7 years ago, except that this time it is directed at a real person who is actually in my life. The assumption I had built 10 years of management on turned out to be wrong. The love was not conditional on the version. It was for the person. I had not given my parents the chance to show me that for 10 years because I was afraid of finding out otherwise, and the fear had cost me 10 years of living in the full sense of that word, and had cost my parents 10 years of knowing their son in the full sense of that word. I do not spend time cataloging the cost because the cost is paid and the accounting does not change it. What I do instead is live in the way I was not living before the dinner with Jessica and the Monday morning call and the Sunday evening when my mother said, "Did you think I did not know my own son?" That question is the answer. She knew, they were waiting, I just had to be ready. My name is Marcus Webb, I am 41 years old. I grew up in Houston in a family that gave me everything, and I spent 10 years being afraid that everything was conditional, and I arranged a fake girlfriend to sit at my dinner table, and I sat in my dark kitchen at midnight afterward, and I finally asked myself the question I had been avoiding for a decade. Who am I when I stop? The answer was the same person I had always been. The same person my parents had always known. The same person who was waiting on the other side of 10 years of management for the courage to simply be present in his own life. Jessica called it right on a Monday morning over the phone. Your parents might be able to handle it. You might be underestimating them. She was right. I was. They could. They did. That is the whole story. If this reached something in you, leave a comment. Tell me where you are watching from. There are more of us out here than any of us knew. Subscribe if you have not already.